On Christmas Eve, 2002, in Modesto, California, a young husband came home from a fishing trip and reported that his wife was missing. She was 27 years old, warm, beloved, and 8 months pregnant with their first child. Within weeks, her face was on every television in America. And so was his. Because the more the country watched Scott Peterson, the calm, handsome salesman pleading for his wife's return, the more people began to wonder about the man behind the microphone. This is the story of Laci Peterson, and of the husband whose perfect surface hid the darkest answer of all. Modesto sits in California's Central Valley, a working city of orchards and warehouses, halfway between San Francisco and the Sierra. It is not Hollywood, and it is not Silicon Valley. It is the ordinary California where ordinary families build ordinary lives. Scott and Laci Peterson looked like the couple the neighborhood rooted for. They had met in college on the Central Coast, where Laci, bright, sunny, famous for her megawatt smile, fell for the polite young man who worked in his father's crate business and dreamed of the good life. Laci Rocha had grown up around Modesto, on her family's dairy farm, the adored daughter of Sharon Rocha and Dennis Rocha. Everyone who describes her reaches for the same words: sunshine, warmth, that smile. She and her mother were unusually close. They spoke nearly every day, about everything. Which is why, on Christmas Eve, Sharon knew instantly that something was terribly wrong. Scott, meanwhile, was the son everyone's parents wished they had, or so it appeared. Charming, athletic, unfailingly polite, he had grown up comfortable in San Diego, golfed well enough to dream of the Pro Tour, and glided through life on a smile that never seemed to slip. People trusted Scott Peterson on sight. It was, in hindsight, his most dangerous talent. By 2002 they had settled in Modesto, in a comfortable house on Covina Avenue. Scott sold agricultural fertilizer. Laci taught, kept an immaculate home, and threw herself into preparing for the baby. It was a boy. They had already named him Connor. He was due in early February. Friends would later describe that autumn as a season of anticipation, showers, gifts, a nursery painted and waiting. If you had asked anyone on that street to name a family with everything ahead of them, they would have pointed at the Petersons. December 24, 2002. According to Scott, he left home mid-morning for a solo fishing trip, not to a lake nearby, but to the Berkeley Marina on San Francisco Bay, 90 miles from Modesto. An odd choice for Christmas Eve. An odd choice, some would say later, for a man with a heavily pregnant wife at home. When he returned that evening, the house was empty. Laci's car was in the driveway. Her purse, her keys and her phone were inside the house. The dog had been found wandering the neighborhood with its leash still on. At 5:15 that evening, the call went out: Laci Peterson was missing. It was Scott who made the first call, not to the police, but to Laci's mother. Sharon Rocha would never forget his exact words. Not, "Is Laci with you?" but, "Laci's missing." A strange way, she thought later, to begin a search. At the time, she pushed the thought away. There were more urgent things to do than parse her son-in-law's grammar. Within hours, Modesto mobilized. Police swept the parks and the irrigation canals. Neighbors walked the streets calling her name into the Christmas darkness. The search for Laci Peterson had begun, and it would grip the entire country for 4 months. Thousands of volunteers turned out. A command center ran around the clock. Rewards climbed. Vigils filled parks with candlelight, and Laci's smiling photograph, that unforgettable smile, looked out from flyers on every telephone pole in the Central Valley. And the cameras came. A beautiful missing mother-to-be, a photogenic husband, a Christmas mystery in the American heartland. Cable news could not look away, and neither could the country. Satellite trucks colonized Covina Avenue. Talk shows debated nightly. Before it was a trial, the Peterson case was already a national obsession. At the center of it all stood the husband. Scott cooperated. Scott gave statements. Scott joined searches. And yet, from the very first days, something about him unsettled people. He seemed composed. Polished. Strangely unbroken, a man performing grief, some whispered, rather than feeling it. Detectives, for their part, were quietly cataloging details. The fishing trip story that shifted in the retelling. The freshly washed clothes. The fact that Scott could not, at first, even say what he had been fishing for. None of it was proof. All of it went into the file. Then, 1 month into the search, the whispers became a thunderclap. A massage therapist from Fresno named Amber Frey came forward with her lawyer. She had been dating Scott Peterson since November. And there was more. Scott had told Amber he was single. Then he had told her something far stranger. In early December, while Laci was alive, healthy, and 8 months pregnant, Scott told Amber that he had been married, and that he had lost his wife. That the coming holidays would be his first without her. Read that timeline again. Weeks before Laci Peterson vanished, her husband was already describing her, to another woman, in the past tense. When Amber saw the news and realized who her boyfriend really was, she did not protect him. She went straight to the Modesto police, and agreed to record every call. The recordings are almost beyond belief. On New Year's Eve, while hundreds of volunteers searched for his missing wife, Scott told Amber he was celebrating in Paris, describing fireworks over the Eiffel Tower from a candlelight vigil in Modesto. Day after day, call after call, the man at the center of a national tragedy performed a carefree bachelor's life, invented in real time. In late January, Scott sat down for a televised interview with Diane Sawyer and made things worse. He admitted the affair, but insisted, incredibly, that he had told Laci all about it, and that the marriage had been at peace. He spoke of his missing wife in gentle tones. And more than once, viewers noticed, he spoke of her in the past tense. And the behavior kept getting darker. Within weeks of the disappearance, Scott sold Laci's car. He inquired about selling the house. He turned the planned nursery into a storage room. Investigators watching him saw a man who did not seem to be waiting for his wife to come home, but tidying up after her departure. Through it all, one detail sat quietly at the heart of the case. Scott's alibi. Of all the places he could have spent that Christmas Eve, he had chosen the open water of San Francisco Bay, and the police knew that if Laci ever surfaced, geography would give its own testimony. In April 2003, after a spring storm churned the bay, it did. A couple walking the shoreline near Richmond found the remains of a full-term baby boy. 1 day later, and 1 mile away, a dog walker found Laci. The bay had returned them, within sight of the Berkeley Marina, the exact stretch of water where Scott Peterson said he had gone fishing. There was also the boat. 2 weeks before Laci vanished, Scott had quietly bought a small aluminum fishing boat, and told almost no one, not even his father-in-law, a fishing partner of years. In his warehouse, investigators found a homemade cement anchor, and evidence, they believed, that several more had been made. The other anchors were never found. We will not describe the condition of the remains. It is enough to say that the forensic evidence was consistent with Laci having entered the water long before, weighted down, and that little Connor had never taken a breath. Mother and son were identified within days. The search was over. The case was not. 5 days later, police moved in, and where they found Scott Peterson told its own story. He was not at home in Modesto, waiting for news. He was 300 miles south, circling a golf course parking lot near San Diego, 30 miles from the Mexican border. His appearance had changed. The dark hair and goatee were dyed orange blonde. In the car, nearly $15,000 in cash, camping equipment, for cell phones, a water purifier, and his brother's driver's license. Scott Peterson has always denied he was running. The jury would be allowed to draw its own conclusion. The People vs. Scott Peterson became the most watched American trial of its decade. Moved out of Modesto to Redwood City in search of an impartial jury, it ran for nearly 6 months, carried live, dissected nightly, argued over at every dinner table in the country. The prosecution's case was circumstantial, and they owned it. No cause of death. No murder weapon. No witness. What they had instead was everything else, the marina alibi that placed him exactly where the bodies surfaced. The cement pitchers in his warehouse. The affair. The recordings. The past tense wife. 1,000 small facts, all leaning the same direction. And then there was Amber. When she took the stand, the courtroom heard the tapes for themselves, hours of them. The easy charm. The effortless lies. Paris on New Year's Eve. Jurors later said it was not one damning sentence that buried Scott Peterson, but the accumulation, the sound of a man performing, fluently, while his wife lay at the bottom of the bay. Laci's family sat through every day of it. Sharon Rocha, who had once loved Scott like a son, listened to the recordings with her hands pressed together. Whatever the defense said about circumstantial evidence, the family had stopped having doubts long before the jury did. The defense called it a rush to judgment, a weak forensic case dressed up with bad character. Being a liar and a cheat, they argued, does not make a man a murderer. For 6 months, America picked a side. And then, in November 2004, 12 jurors picked theirs. Even reaching a verdict was chaos. Deliberations collapsed twice, 2 jurors, including the foreman, were dismissed and replaced, and the panel was ordered to start again. Court watchers braced for a hung jury. Instead, with its final composition, the jury needed barely 7 hours. Guilty. First-degree murder for Laci. Second-degree for Connor. Outside the courthouse, a crowd erupted in cheers that were broadcast live, a raw, startling moment that showed just how personally the country had taken this case. A month later, the same jury recommended the ultimate penalty. In March 2005, Scott Peterson was sentenced to death. At San Quentin, the state's most famous death row inmate settled into a strange celebrity. He received fan mail. Marriage proposals. Supporters who ran websites proclaiming his innocence. Year after year, appeal after appeal, the machinery of California's death penalty ground forward, slowly, and then not at all. He was sent to San Quentin's death row, and for 15 years, that seemed to be the end of the story. It was not. In 2020, the California Supreme Court overturned his death sentence, not his conviction, ruling that potential jurors had been improperly dismissed during selection. In 2021 he was resentenced to life without parole, and moved off death row. And the story is still not finished. In recent years, an innocence organization has taken up parts of his case, and Scott Peterson, now in his 50s, gray and weathered, continues to insist, as he has for more than 2 decades, that he is innocent. His defenders point to threads they say were never pulled: a burglary across the street from the Peterson home that same week, a burned-out van, witnesses who reported seeing Laci walking the dog that morning. Prosecutors answer that every one of those threads was examined and led nowhere. So far, the courts have agreed, petition after petition has been denied. The courts, so far, have been unmoved. The conviction stands. And for the family of Laci Peterson, every new headline, every documentary, every appeal reopens the same wound, the loss of a daughter, a sister, and a grandson who never drew breath. Laci and Connor were laid to rest together in Modesto, after a memorial service attended by thousands. Her family has spent the years since guarding her memory, insisting that this story belongs to Laci, the woman with the unforgettable smile, and not to the man whose name shares her headstone in the headlines. The case changed American law, too. Congress passed legislation, widely known as Laci and Connor's Law, recognizing an unborn child as a separate victim in federal crimes of violence. Whatever else the Peterson case left behind, it left that. At sentencing, Sharon Rocha finally faced the man she had once welcomed as a son, and spoke for the daughter who could not. Divorce was always an option, she told him, murder never was. It remains one of the most devastating victim statements ever delivered in an American courtroom. And it left a question that still splits rooms 20 years later. There was no weapon. No witness. No cause of death. Everything the jury heard was circumstantial, and yet 12 strangers were certain enough to send a man to death row. So here is my question for you. Look at everything you know about Scott Peterson, and tell me, honestly, in the comments, are you certain? And if you are, what single fact convinced you? Subscribe, because the next case is already waiting. Some fences are white. And some smiles are rehearsed.